If somebody were to ask you, what is the most important thing that you should do with your life? How would you answer that question? Now, perhaps you might say, and you'd be right, that I need to love God and serve God. That's the most important thing in my life. And you'd be right if you'd say that. In fact, you were created by God, and I was too. We were made by Him to experience His love, to learn how to love Him, so that we can be with Him for all eternity. We were made to know God. But if somebody were to ask you, what's the second most important thing that you could do with your life, how would you answer that? You do know that you were not put on this planet to just accomplish a list of to-do items. You and I were not made to just go about our lives with a list of activities to accomplish. There is one thing that we were put on this planet to do. Our text this morning is Matthew 22, verses 34 to 39. And we're going to look at that text here and begin at verse 34, and we see that Jesus is encountering some critics. He has already encountered a group of critics called the Sadducees, which have tried to trip him up in his teaching, asking him questions about the nature of the resurrection. But there's another group of Jewish religious leaders called the Pharisees that whenever they heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they met together and they wanted to question Jesus too. So one of their group, one of these Pharisees, stepped forward. He was an expert in religious law. And he tried to trap Jesus with a question. Now I want you to notice here that when it says that he tried to trap Jesus with a question, that this is not just merely an academic debate. It's not just like a theoretical discussion. He is really strategically asking Jesus a specific question with the intention to get Jesus to say something that would get him in trouble with people. Because they're trying to find a way to get rid of Jesus. So, what question might he ask to try to trap Jesus? Well, here's the question, verse number 36. Teacher, which is the most important commandment in the law of Moses? Now, you see how they're trying to trap him? The Jewish religious leaders of the day were very serious about the law of Moses and enforcing the fact that people observe and keep the law of Moses. And so by asking Jesus, of all of the commands, and by the way, they had calculated, the rabbis had some 613 of them, of all of those 613 commandments in the law of Moses, which one do you say is the most important one? Because this puts Jesus, so they think, in a position where no matter how he answers, he's going to infuriate somebody. Because if he answers with one particular law, it's going to appear as if he's elevating it over others and therefore de-emphasizing the importance of other laws, and it leaves him open to tremendous attack to the effect that Jesus belittles these other laws by emphasizing one as being more important than the rest. Well, the rabbis of Jesus' day, the religious teachers, they had ongoing discussions about which commands are light in nature and which ones are heavy in nature. You see, for them, the focus was always on law, on the things you do, on the rules that you keep. What is it that I have to do? You see, if your focus is on law, your focus is upon what you accomplish or how well you perform. And if you perform really well in your estimation or in the estimation of others, it puts you in a position looking down your nose at others who have not performed as well. And so they're focused on the things that you do, how well that you perform. And Jesus skillfully answers their question to focus not on the things of ritual, but on the things of relationship. Jesus says in verse 37, here's his answer. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your mind. Jesus chooses, of all of the things said in the law of Moses, he chooses Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse number 5. Now, this is a passage that the very ones questioning Jesus would have been thoroughly familiar with. In fact, every Jew in Jesus' day that was pious in their efforts to try to keep the law of Moses would have dutifully, and dare I say religiously, recited what is called the Shema. This passage in Deuteronomy chapter 6, this statement of there is only one God, the Lord our God, and you shall love him with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. They would recite this every single day. Not only would they recite it, but they would actually write it on pieces of paper, put it on little boxes, and attach them to the door frame of their home so that when they came out of the home, they would touch the box, or when they would leave the home or go into the home, they would touch the box. They would even put these little passages on paper and in a little box and tie it on their foreheads. This passage, and this is the one Jesus chooses, moving them away from regulations of the law, he moves them and points them toward relationship with God, the greatest command above everything else is to love God with everything you have. In fact, he says this is the first and greatest commandment. In other words, it is of central importance. There is no other command in all of Scripture, no other thing that God has ever said that supersedes this statement. This is the single most important thing you could do with your life, is to put God above everything else, to love him with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then he says, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Here he quotes Leviticus 19:18. He picks another passage from the law of Moses. And from this passage you see that this second command is not so much a second one as it is very much similar to the first. In fact, he says it's like it. It's of the same nature. In other words, if you put the first command as premier importance in your life to love God with everything you have, then what will naturally flow from it is that you will love people the same way you love yourself. Because if you know God and you love him with everything that you have, and you know his real nature is that he is a God of love, that encounter with God is transformative to your life and it is infectious. And you will love other people when you encounter the love of God that way. Love your neighbor. In other words, seek their good and their well-being at the same level and fervency and energy with which you would seek your own well-being and good. In verse 40, he says, all the law and the prophets hang on these two commands. Jesus is giving us an interpretive principle for understanding the Old Testament, the law of Moses. He says, you want the key to interpretation, to understand everything the law of Moses ever said, anything that was ever commanded by God, you want to understand it. Here is the hermeneutical key, the interpretive key to understanding and applying the entire law, and that is love God and love people. In fact, if you look at the 10 Commandments, the first 4 of them have everything to do with loving God. And the last 6 have everything to do with doing things so that you're loving your neighbor as yourself, or avoiding doing behaviors that would compromise that kind of relationship. In other words, Jesus is saying, listen, everything, you want to sum up the entire Bible, everything the Bible is saying, everything God ever commanded is all about loving God and loving people. What does that mean? It means relationships. The Bible is all about relationships. Everything God ever said was designed to promote and to protect relationships. But I just have to ask some questions when I read what Jesus says here. Some questions come to my mind that I want to entertain with you for a moment. Questions like, how can you command somebody to love? You see, the guy comes to him with this question, what's the greatest commandment? And Jesus' response is, the greatest of all commandments is to love. Love God, love others. But how can you command somebody to love? The problem comes in because often in the English language, we think about love primarily, if not exclusively, in terms of emotion, affection, feeling. But when Jesus says that the greatest command of all is to love, he uses a word in the Greek language, the word being agape. Now that word is a word that is very precise and describes something that is different than just mere emotion or feeling. In fact, as you probably know, the Greeks had multiple words to describe the concept that we have a general word for love with all of its multifaceted dimensions. They had more specific language to describe various aspects of that. Jesus doesn't choose a brotherly kind of love, phileo. He doesn't use storge or eros. He uses a word that is very specific. He says the greatest command is that you agape God and you agape your neighbor as yourself. So the question is, what does Jesus have in mind here? And you need to know that what he has in mind is not primarily a feeling, but instead it's a choice. Agape love is foremost a choice of the will. It's not something that you do based upon how you feel about the situation. It's not based upon good feelings or emotions or how attracted you are to an individual or an impulse that you have to do good. Instead, it's not the result of emotion. Instead, the word agape has everything to do with action. It is a choice to treat people a certain way. It is a decision of the will. In fact, it's not a desire, but it's to actually will the good of others around you. It's the opposite of insisting on your own way. It is instead putting at premier importance the good of others at the same level that you would seek your own good. So let me just pause here and say that these leaders come to Jesus trying to trap him. You and I are often trapped too, whether we realize it or not. You and I are often trapped in misplaced priorities in life. How often, at a time like the new year, when you're doing some introspection and some self-evaluation, and you look over the course of the past year or the past 5 years, the past decade, or over the entirety of a life that you have lived up to this point, and you could say, you know, there's some things I wish I'd done different. There's some things, some choices that I've made where I have put things of lesser importance to the forefront. And there are things that really are more important in life that I've not put as primary significance. You see, life is filled with voices that try to get us to put as priority other things of lesser value to the forefront. And at this new year, we need to hear the words of Jesus when they try to trap him with voices of trying to think about things to put at the top of the list. And Jesus gives clarity and he says, look, of all the things you could do with your life, of all the commandments, of all the lists, of all the things to do that you have in front of you, it could be 613 things that you could be doing with your life. He says the most important thing, if you don't do anything else, is to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love the people around you the same way you love yourself. In other words, what he's saying is don't get trapped in misplaced priorities. Instead, you need to speak to yourself with the force of a command. Speak to yourself and make a choice to adopt a style of life where you say, if I don't do anything else with the life that I live, I will put God and the people around me first. So this is the point of the sermon, where you and I, we kind of do some inventory. What kind of corrections do I need to make? What kind of corrections do you need to make in the new year to reprioritize and make sure that I'm putting God and people first and prioritizing the relationships of my life? Another question that comes to the forefront whenever I look at what Jesus is telling these folks is, why do we seem to have the propensity, the tendency to want to be experts at law? You notice it was an expert in the law that came to Jesus. Why is it that we tend to do that? Why is it that we tend to be oftentimes so focused on knowing the things to do and putting such a premier importance on the to-do list rather than on the relationships with the people around us? Why are we such experts at doing that? Why do we always want to seem to focus on our achievements, the tasks at hand? I think it's because of pride, selfish ambition, wanting to position myself above others around me. But Jesus directs them away from being experts at law, and he points them and you and me to relationships. And Jesus essentially says the number one thing that matters in life are relationships, not the tasks, not the work, not the achievements. It's all about God and people. And we should put such a heavy emphasis on that you and I, we should be at least making every effort we can toward becoming experts, not at law, but becoming experts at relationships, creating relationships, building relationships, cultivating relationships, repairing relationships, maintaining relationships, increasing relationships. We should become experts at relationships. Jesus says this is what is most important. It's the greatest command of all, is first of all, cultivate your relationship with God. Because if you put as first importance the second command over the first, and you focus on people, but you're not fueled by your relationship with God, you will end up taking advantage of people or becoming codependent upon people. God says, no, you depend upon me first. Find your peace, find your strength, find your confidence in your relationship with me, and love me with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And when you do that, then you will be in a much better place to be able to love people sacrificially, not for what you can get out of the relationship, but instead, like me, what you're putting into the relationship. But I wonder when Jesus says, the second is like it. How is the second command like the first command? Well, as I have already somewhat alluded to, I think what he's getting at is the fact that real love for God is infectious. Whenever we love God with everything that we are, there is a natural overflow from that relationship. That deep love from God will flow out into our relationships with other people. Church, I want to tell you that for a long time, I think I was misled. Maybe it was my fault. Maybe no one misled me. But somehow along the way, I had this mistaken understanding that the most mature thing I could do to grow in my walk with God is to gain knowledge. Like if I could gain more and more knowledge, that the mark of maturity is knowledge of Scripture and knowledge of spiritual things. And Jesus seems to indicate that, look, if you focus upon having a personal relationship with God, the mark of your true spiritual maturity is that relationship with God will flow directly toward cultivating relationships with people. The mark of spiritual maturity is learning how to do relationships well. We should become experts at it. And so I would say to myself and say to you, if the last couple of years, maybe out of necessity, you found yourself isolating from the people around you, you found yourself distancing from the relationships around you, the past is the past. But from this day forward, let's make a commitment to remember the one thing that matters most. And let's remember that what matters more than anything else is not avoiding the relationships in my life, but instead cultivating the relationships of my life. What matters most are people. Nothing matters more in my walk with God than learning to be like God and love the people around me and pour into those relationships. In fact, if you need some scripture to convince you of that, one of Jesus' followers, the Apostle John, said in 1 John 4 and verse 8, a statement that is so crystal clear. He said, if anyone doesn't love, they don't know God. For God is love. You see, you can be a religious expert who thinks you know everything theologically about God. You think you can diagram, you can teach a class, you can give a lecture, you can tell the world everything that there is to know about God. And John says, if you don't love the people around you, you can think you know God and you've never met Him. You don't know Him. Because to know God is to know that God is love. And when you know that God is love, you will love the people around you. That's how the second is like the first. Well, as we draw to a close, there's a practical question that comes to my mind from what Jesus has to say to these religious leaders. And that is, what does it really mean to love others? What does it really mean? I'll tell you something that oftentimes we think in good Southern Christian culture we think that it means, that it doesn't mean, is that to love others is not just about being nice to people. Do you realize that being nice, and I'm not against being nice, but hear me on this. Do you realize that we can often use being nice as a facade and an excuse to keep from really engaging the people around us? We can be really sweet and nice on the surface as an effort to try to disengage from the people around us. In fact, being nice can be spiritually disastrous because it really avoids seeking the true good of the people around us. You see, I can be super nice, but then really never have any investment. I can really not love my neighbor as myself. I just am nice to kind of get them out of the way so I can get to the stuff I want to do, to focus on me instead of them. You know, seeking the good of people around me and you. It means sometimes we have to have hard conversations that don't really feel very nice, but they're the things that are really the most loving. Difficult conversations to resolve problems that may have come up in relationships. To speak truthfully and honestly in a compassionate way, not being insensitive, but sometimes the things that are most needed to heal relationships are a few faithful wounds, like Proverbs 27:5 talks about. So I just want to say that Scripture and Jesus is saying to me in my life, and maybe saying to you, what are some difficult conversations that you've been delaying with the facade of being nice? That really we need to love in a more deep way than that, where we're genuinely seeking the good for people, not just trying to get them out of the way. So first of all, what does it really mean to love the others around us? It's not necessarily about being nice. It's much deeper than that. But also it means having a sense of the sacredness of the people around us. Do you realize that every single person that you meet has been just as much made in the image of God as you? If you recognize that there is something special about you, that you've been created and made by a loving God and put here for a purpose, do you not realize that the person you meet on the street or in the supermarket has just as much the same level of importance as you? Love your neighbor as yourself, Jesus says. And if you're trying to be charitable to others around you, but you don't recognize the sacredness of their existence being the same as your own, your charity diminishes their dignity because you're just trying to appease your conscience instead of actually love them well as yourself. Finally, what does it mean to love the people around us? Agape love means it always involves action. Scripture is clear on this. Again, John in 1 John 4 and verse 20 says, if you say you love God but you hate your fellow human being, your fellow person around you, you're a liar. You don't really love God. If you say you have faith but you don't help somebody in need, James says your faith is dead in James 2 verses 14 through 16. So agape is not so much about what I'm feeling, it is a choice that I make, an action that I take on to do good and seek the good and the goodwill of the people around me. This is the one thing that matters more than anything else. It is the one thing that you and I were put on this planet to do, is to learn to love God first, and to love the people around me as I love myself.